Hi everyone, I'm Tom from ProWritingAid. Thank you for joining us for yet another session in the ProWritingAid Ask a Book Doctor series. As usual, my guest for these webinars is Sally OJ. How are you doing today, Sally?
I'm doing great, Tom. Thanks. How are you? I feel like I always give people a little weather report, and it's so cold in England at the moment. It is snowing, it is freezing cold, but I feel toasty, I feel warm and ready to go.
Yeah, fantastic. It is cold, but it's very fresh and it was very bright today, so it's very nice. Okay, Sally, it's a long-awaited event tonight or today, and I always feel like apologizing because I think we were originally scheduled to do historical fiction in November, and here we are in February, just getting to it. But there's been a lot of anticipation around it. Okay, and I want to kick off just by asking a really obvious question. Could you just tell us exactly what historical fiction means?
Well, you'd think that would be easy, wouldn't you? It's most people think, sort of think costume drama. So they think Edwardian, Victorian, or Renaissance, going back to the Tudors. And there's a sort of subgenre of historical fiction, which is the ancient world, so ancient Greece, ancient Rome. But in fact, now I think if you wrote a book about World War II, that could snuggle into historical fiction. I recently-ish worked on a book that was set in the 50s and was marketed as historical, which I'm not 100% certain of, but I think, the 50s is quite a long time ago now. So I think it's when you venture into the past, when clothes are different, when people spoke differently, and when it was a different world, basically. Sorry.
Okay.
That's historical fiction.
Okay. So we've got to go on.
There is a, as a genre, historical fiction is a very specific thing. It's got a huge readership, historical fiction, and those readers expect certain things. We'll talk about this more. And they know what they want from a book that's called historical fiction. So to a degree, you're working in a very well established genre, and of course you can mess about with things and stuff, but it's a very clearly defined genre.
Would you say the most popular genre for new authors, because based on the work that you see?
Well, interestingly enough, I've been getting a lot more historical fiction in the last few years, much more than I used to at the beginning of my sort of career about 25-26 years ago. And there's a very good reason for this, and that's because a lot of plots don't really work if you've got a mobile phone, a cell phone. They don't really work if you can just look something up on the internet.
Right.
They don't really work if you've got great forensics. So people are pushing their stories back more and more. I mean, even, to the 70s or the 60s, or even the 80s, but, pushing them back so that things are credible. You can't just say, like my daughter said to me when I was reading her a story when she was about 3, and a fairy story, and she said, why doesn't she just text him? So you have to that's one of the reasons that a lot of people are turning to historical now, when they wouldn't necessarily have done before.
Okay, interesting. Right, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. A really interesting point, just how the landscape changes with the advent of technology and mobile phones. Be interesting to hear our listeners' take on that. Is that something that they've kind of wrestled with, or has been an influence in their decision what story where their story is set and when their story is set? But okay, so let's get into a bit of detail then around what what are the classic pitfalls, or some of the classic pitfalls, or the problems you see with the historical fiction that you review? What are the things you see time and time again that make you?
Well, there's lots of possible pitfalls. I would say one of the most common things is, and they're sort of going from the back end of this, really, but one of the most common things I see is that it's very difficult when you're writing historical fiction. We're going to get to the much more obvious stuff in a minute.
Yeah.
But it's difficult to really remember how narrow these people's worlds were. You know, the further back you go, the smaller their worlds were, the smaller their knowledge was. Even if there were books around they'd read, if you go back to even to the Victorian times, you know, if somebody was well read but hadn't traveled, you know, even India is hot was kind of meaningless to an English person, because they knew what hot was in England, but they had no sense of what hot could really be.
Yeah.
You know, they'd read about a whale, but they had no comprehension of what a whale could really be. And that's the sort of bigger picture, but it goes to much, much smaller things as well. So you have to keep thinking all the time, what would they actually know? What would this person actually have access to? And even if they had access to that knowledge, what would that mean? So that's quite a big thing. But I think the most obvious thing I think you might have thought I was going to say is research, obviously.
Yeah.
If you're writing an historical novel, you have got to do your research, and that doesn't mean like looking up Tudors on the internet for a day. It means real, proper, deep tissue, sweaty, horrible, oh God, I never want to read another book about the Tudors again kind of research. And because, well, for several reasons. One is, of course, because you want your book to be as authentic as possible. But also because if a reader who is reading your book because they're interested in the Tudors, say, for example, of that period of time, if they find one mistake, they're going to lose all sense of trust in you as a writer. I don't mean really obscure things. You know, you're allowed to get, you know, the name of a certain flower that only blooms once, you know, every 40 years, a bit wrong. But, you know, something that a reader could spot and think that, oh, I don't think that's right. So you've really, really got to do your research, and you've got to do proper research. And by proper research, I mean, ideally reading books, not using the internet.
Okay. Why is that?
Well, the internet is great, and it is obviously a great source of information. But you've got to be, if you're using the internet for proper research, you've got to be terribly, terribly careful about the sites that you go to, because we all know that the internet, anyone can put anything up on the internet.
Yeah.
And so if you use the internet, it's better to cross-reference stuff that you find, just to make sure that it's right, unless you're using a source that you're absolutely certain of, which of course you might well do. If you've got a book about the Tudors written by an expert on the Tudors who spent 12 years researching their book, you're gonna get good stuff in there.
Yeah. The
danger is of sorry, I'm just going to write something down so I don't do my usual thing of saying, oh no, I've forgotten. The danger is, if you start to research and you get such a wealth of information, is the desire to cram it all into your story. That's
okay.
You know, I do see that sometimes, that somebody has just found out all this fantastic stuff about daily life of the Tudors, and it's just all been pushed and crammed and scrunched.
You just want to demonstrate your knowledge and everything you've done.
Yeah. Well, I think it's excitement as well.
Yes.
I think it's just excitement. So you have to pick and choose a bit, which can be very painful. It can be very difficult. You know, you found all these wonderful things out.
So, basically, you know, looking at some of the people you've worked with, and how much research are we talking, right? Because I understand the writing process is hard, and I get the feeling that a lot of people get to this stage and they get into the research and they realize just how much there is to do, and can hit a real, you know, it becomes a real mountain to overcome. But how much research do you see goes into, you know,
I mean, a lot. When you know, the book that I was talking about that was set in the 50s, she'd spent a good couple of years getting all her information right.
Right.
When you go back further, you know, Sarah Waters, who I've worked with, spends months and months and months sitting in the British Library. Not everyone can get to the British Library,
Yeah.
But doing really proper research, and it shows in her books. So you're looking at, I would say at least 6 months of properly getting to know your period, reading books, watching documentaries if you can find them on YouTube, using all resources. I know I just said be careful of the internet, and of course using the internet, but just be a bit, just use your judgment well with the internet. The other thing, if you're writing, I talked about World War II just now. If you're writing about a period where, a lot of films were made during World War II, watch those films, because this is how people spoke. This is the objects that they used. This was the sort of way people thought in those days. If you were lucky enough to be, it's like a window into that time.
Yeah.
So, if you can do that, and it's the same with books written during the period. If you're writing, about the Victorians, there are plenty of books written during that period that you can use to get a sort of sense of the time and the place.
So hold that thought, because you just made me think about speaking and dialogue. I want to come to that in a second, but I'm interested to know. I'm sure our our listeners today will have good ideas for where they do research as well. I mean, we mentioned British Library, and I'm sure you've all got your equivalents. And because Julie Acker, I think, mentioned getting an academic subscription to JSTOR for academic articles, which are very solid and very current.
That's a great idea.
Yeah,
that's a great idea. I mean, there's a very, very famous author of ancient historical fiction called Mary Renault. Yeah. And she's best known for writing a trilogy about Alexander the Great, but all her books are set in ancient Greece. I think there's a couple set in Rome, and they are fantastic. And she is the historian's favorite novelist. You can find documentaries about Mary Renault on YouTube when you've got all these real historians just drooling over her and saying, she is my favorite historical author. And what she used to do, she did years of research, because she had never actually been to Greece. She was English, but she lived in South Africa. And this was in the 40s and 50s. And she did eventually go to Greece, but when she wrote most of her books. So she did so much research. And when you read them, you can't believe she's never been to Greece. I mean, just the atmosphere, never mind the historical detail. But what she does in her books is she does such extremely deep research, and she reads documents in Latin and all of these things, probably translations. I don't know, she could speak Latin, I think. But she says in her books, look, this is all historical facts. They're fictionalizations of historical incidents. All these facts are true. They all happened as far as we can tell. Here are my sources. But at this point in the book, there is no record of what happened at this period, say in Alexander the Great's life. Yeah. So what I have done, I know what happened before that point, and I know what happened after that point. So what I have done is I've made the best possible informed guess that I could. Right. And I think this is something that if you can't get research, or if you decide to stray a little bit outside what's really happened, as long as you state that very clearly. I know another historical author, she's great. She writes about the Elizabethan period. And she says at the beginning of the book, says that most of this is bang on, but some of it I've just made up. Yeah. So, so as long as you do that, then the reader will relax.
So this comes to your point of trust, right?
Yeah.
So if you're going to take liberties, or you need to be clear and honest and put that in a prologue.
Yeah.
Okay. And sorry, while we're on the subject of research, because I know Shirley has had some questions about this, and I'm just looking where it was, and it was about references. So, this is typical. I can't. Oh, there we go. Do you have to include your sources at the end of your novel?
It's a good idea to do it. 98% of people will never look at them, but for the 2% who do, it's very valuable, and it's very reassuring for a reader to look and see that they're there. Right. They might not check them, but they think, oh, this person's done their homework. it's kind of, I mean, if you think of the historical novels you've got, there's always a list at the back of their, you know, the books that they've read, or the articles that they've read, or the papers. And I think it's a good idea. Yes, you don't have
I'm,
to.
I remember being, sorry to cut it. I was just saying, Sal, I remember getting to the end of one of Sarah's books actually, and being amazed at just how many references, how big that reference section was, and actually quite intrigued because I'd kind of fallen in love with the book and I wanted to find out more about the era. So actually, I was looking at that reference section, thinking, oh, I wonder which of these I should go on and have a look at myself. Be quite, but so okay, so it's a good idea, it's a good discipline, but nobody says you have to.
Nobody says you have to, but I think I would advise you to keep a record of your sources and to use them.
Yeah. Okay.
Put them at the back. Yeah.
Okay. Now coming back to another question, you mentioned how people speak, and this is already something that's brought up questions as well. How do you reflect dialogue of the era? Because, you know, if you're going back a couple of hundred years or whatever, it's markedly different. Are you true to that? Do you reflect exactly as it would have been, or what's the balance?
Well, it depends how far back you're going. You know, I think if you're going World War II or even World War I, you can be pretty true to how people really spoke. But this comes back again to what I said: readers of historical fiction have certain expectations, and they want ye oldie fashionedy dialogue-y. That's what they want. But what they don't want, because it would be gibberish and they wouldn't be able to understand it, is really how Elizabethan spoke, or really how the Tudors spoke, or really even how people in, you know, the Restoration spoke. And certainly not really how people in ancient Greece spoke. So what they want is something that they think sounds like historical dialogue, and we all know what that is. It's a certain kind of formalization to a degree, or it's a certain kind of, you know, it's using the right expressions, which aren't the right expressions at all, but they are what people think will be the right expressions for that time. You know, you can make them up.
Yeah.
But so it's finding the sort of balance between getting a sense of the place and time without, of course, actually giving us how people spoke. Because if you go, you know, you can get away with it to a degree with the Victorians. I think again, you have to, you know, I always enjoy a Victorian manuscript when somebody thrusts something into their reticule. That always makes me laugh. But you know, that's just about, people just about know what a reticule is, or they can work it out. But you go back too far and you just start confusing people. So you can drop.
Okay.
And this is true of the narrative, of course, as well, I'm talking about now. But with both the dialogue and the narrative, you can be authentic yet not authentic. That's what people really want.
So when it comes to vocabulary that you may not recognize, or we may not recognize, and actually it's probably, you know, you don't need to.
You don't. Well, there's two things here. I'm going to make a note again. So because there's two things, and I'll inevitably say I've forgotten the first one. So the one way you can do it is by having a glossary at the back of the book. And if you know, if you decide that you want to go sort of a bit hardcore and not have to explain all, because you don't want to dive into exposition, you don't want to dive into information dumps, which is really not a good idea. We can talk about that a bit more in a bit. Then if you have a glossary at the back, then that's a good way to go. And you know what, I wrote a note and I've still forgotten. What was the question?
You're allowed to look at, I think you've answered the question, Sally. It was about vocabulary.
There was something else I wanted to say, and it was possibly important. What did you ask?
We'll come back to you.
No, what did you ask? What was the question?
Oh, so it's about vocabulary. It was about using actual, you know, vocabulary of the time.
Oh yeah, I do remember. So if some people decide, I'm just going to go modern, I'm just going to go contemporary, I'm just going to have people speaking as they would now, and quite a lot of people do this. It's not exactly what people want, but if it's done well, it works. The trouble is you've really got to find the balance.
Yeah.
You've really got to find the balance, because you can't have somebody in, oh, you know what, I said to you I was going to try and think of an example of this, didn't I? But you can't.
We prefer the examples you come up with live, Sal.
You can't have somebody in Victorian times saying, I mean, this actually does sound a bit Victorian, but you can't have people sort of saying, "You winding me up." You know, you've got to use. You can't use expressions that immediately ground us in the 21st century or even the 20th century. They've got to be a bit more ambiguous. So if you decide to go modern with your dialogue, or contemporary with your dialogue, do be careful that you don't use anything that really pins people down to the 21st century. Like, don't say, "Are you chilling?" for example. That's a good example, because that's really quite, that's sort of 90s. Nobody said that before then, and it's very, very specific. So, but some people do decide to think, "I can't be bothered with all this historical dialogue. I'm just going to have them speaking normally."
Well, the opposite. I mean, Barb makes a good point that if if you do, for example, you use a glossary or whatever, you're asking the reader to then disrupt their flow, disrupt the, you ask them to constantly, you lose the beat of the piece, as Barb says.
Well, that is true, but a lot of readers, if a glossary is there, will just trust that it is there. So unless they're really puzzled, most readers can, if you talk about thrust, if a lady gets her pen out of her reticule, even if you've never heard the word reticule before, and it's hilarious, but you can work out pretty much what it is. So if you can pretty much work things out, but that glossary is there at the back, you don't necessarily go. You can go, you can go there at the end and work things out. It actually, if you get into the groove of it, I use glossaries all the time. It's true that you don't want to pull your reader out of the story, but you also don't want them completely confused. So a quick flick, if I'm reading an historical novel and there's a glossary, I just keep my finger in the glossary, and then if it's done properly, like page by page or alphabetically is best, but for me personally, I can just flick, oh, that's what it means. It's a kind of a handbag. Great. So it's I'm always cautioning people, don't make your readers leave. It's different from going to Google. If it's there in the book that you're holding, it's not as bad.
Good point. And I think, like you say, give some consideration to how you lay it out.
Very important. And many people will do a glossary, in order of the the pages, but I think an alphabetical one is easier personally, but that's entirely down to people's personal taste.
I think I'd agree from the ones I've used. While we're on the subject of accuracy, Sal, Gary has asked about factual accuracy for characters. So when using real historical characters, do you maintain their factual accuracy?
Well, if you're writing about an historical person, it's obviously 99% of it is going to be made up, isn't it? Because you're writing about their daily life or whatever, and people will know that and accept it. I've worked on several books lately, actually, but just by it's funny. I find my job is a bit like waiting for a bus. You wait, you don't have an historical novel for ages, and then 3 come along at once. It's quite strange. But I worked on a very good Roman novel recently, which was based on real events and real people. People who had been the very big events that had been recorded very faithfully, and he had taken a few liberties. And I was there was a point where I was saying to him, "But this didn't actually happen." And he said, "No, it's all right. I'm going to say at the beginning, that it's based on these historical events, but this is my version of these historical events."
Okay. So again, we're back to the prologue.
Kind of, or just a note at the beginning. It can be a prologue. What you've got to be careful is if if people are in living memory, you've got to be careful. You know, if people's descendants are still knocking around, then you've got to be very careful. And you've got to be careful of you know, what could be considered slander.
Yes.
You know, well, to a degree you have. I mean, if you write a book saying that Elizabeth I was you know, a crazed drug addict who liked to go to raves every Saturday night, you're going to get people who feel very strongly about that, and they won't like it. But you know, that's you have to just roll with the punches. You make your decision. What is thorny is to get into stuff where there are living relatives of somebody who, or even you know, quite distant descendants, but of a famous person who might take exception. But I think if you know, you can get away with an awful lot by saying at the beginning of the book, this is just my take. I've used this character as a starting point. This is just my take. But it can get a bit thorny sometimes. But you know, in the great good luck, if you have the great good luck to be published, they will probably run a legal comb over things if it's a real person.
Okay. So that brings us on to another question about, which is linked to kind of accuracy, I guess. When, you know, how much of this can you expect your editor, for example, your publisher, to take care of? You know, to keep an eye out for how.
Now, this is just I'm going to give I'm going to write my own prologue here. This is just my opinion.
Yeah.
In my experience of reading historical fiction, now this isn't on books I've worked on necessarily, but in my experience of reading historical fiction, publishers do not do anything they assume that you have. A big part of my job is catching anachronisms and questioning things. That's a huge part of my job, because as a book doctor, it was a bit more than an editor. This is something that I do. I spent half a morning once just trying to find out when orange carrots were first grown in England, because the carrots were purple before, and they came to England when William of Orange became king, but when actually people started growing, this is stuff that I can spend hours on.
I love this part of your job.
I love this part of my job too. I adore it. But from reading historical fiction, and because I've had years of doing this kind of stuff, I sometimes have these, needles screeching off the record moments when I'm reading something, and I think, dear God, did nobody check this? But the thing is, I believe that mostly publishers and agents are going to assume that you've done that work.
Yeah. Okay.
And then they are not going to spend time. They don't have the time to fact check. It depends on the book. It depends who it's about. It depends on a lot of things. And you might also get an agent or a publisher who is very knowledgeable about that time period or that person. And then, of course, they'll be very helpful. But do not assume that should your book get published, it's going to be fact checked, because my guess is it probably won't be. It depends on it depends on a whole bunch of stuff. But I've certainly seen so many mistakes in historical fiction that initially really surprised me until I worked out what the deal is.
Sal, I'm going to move straight into some questions because they really are piling up, and I know I've been making notes as well, because I know we must talk about sensibilities, so don't forget to talk about that in a minute. But can we just touch on, and I promise Shirley we're going to get this question answered. I know she emailed in about this as well, or has emailed in previously, and it's talking about epilogues, okay, and what form or style they should take. Can it be a simple comment, the telling of an event, or would it be better written as a continuation of the story? Can it be a simple update on a parliamentary act, for example? There's quite a lot there.
An epilogue is usually a continuation of the story. So, 10 years later, 20 years later, their son walked over the horizon or whatever. If you're going to make notes about an update of a parliamentary bill, that is end notes. in a book. I would personally say. So you have a little section at the back which is not part of the novel. It just says, here are some facts. And again, if you look at your historical novels, you'll see that very, very, very often. So an epilogue usually is a continuation of the story, and it's quite often, mostly I think, set a little bit later, or sometimes it changes to a different perspective or point of view. So that is what an epilogue usually is. And if you want to say, section 28, not very historical, doesn't exist now, it was repealed on this day, then that's an end note, I would say. Can I just actually say, Tom, that several people have taken the trouble to get in touch with me on Twitter to say how much they were looking forward to this session, and I'm so thrilled that people are watching and interested, and it really means a great deal to me to know that we're not just talking into a vacuum. Well, obviously not, because everyone's joins in on the day, but it's lovely to have that kind of feedback, and thank you everyone who said that.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Right, let's talk quickly about look at that. Barb's just said, listening to Sally is my favorite education provided by PWA.
Well,
tell the rest of PWA that, Barb. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
So let's talk for a second about sensibilities.
Sensibilities, really important. Ties in a little bit to that thing I said about remembering how small their worlds were. So if you're writing about a Victorian father, now you're say we're going with generalizations here. So if the Victorian father says to his wife, "Oh, you must be tired this evening, darling, I'll put the kids down and make their supper." No, that's a 21st century dad, maybe a 20th century dad. You've got to stick to the morals. Especially writers tend to make men more sympathetic than they would have been at the time. There's a huge temptation to do that, because if he's your protagonist, you don't want him to be a bit of a bastard and step over his wife lying weeping on the floor. Not that they would necessarily be that bad, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It especially tends to be around children. It especially tends to be around men's attitude to women, and especially tends to be around men's attitude to sex. And of course, down through history, there have been tremendously great blokes who've been brilliant. I think what you have to say is, if you have a man or any character who goes against type, what the general sort of accepted social mores would have been in those days, you have to somehow make it clear that he's unusual. One way or another. It's a wife talking to another woman and saying, "I can't believe that your Tom does that." I can't think of another man who would do that. So you've got to really be careful of not letting 20th or 21st century sensibilities slide into your story without you noticing. And the temptation is really big, but you've got to think about how things were. And that's a challenge, that's a creative challenge, and that's really exciting. How can you make your protagonist, male or female, still very sympathetic within those limitations? It's a great creative exercise, actually.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. Okay, so I'm just going through the questions, trying to all put some order to them, because there's a lot to get through. Michelle makes an interesting point. Presumably you can study historical speech patterns by reading fiction written contemporaneously. So Jane Austen, Bronte's, for example.
That's what I just said. Absolutely, you must do that. I really strongly suggest you do. The thing is, if you read Jane Austen, it's going to be very hard for you to recreate it faithfully, because she was writing it in the day. So give it your best. Give it your best, Jane Austen, and that would be okay.
Yeah.
But to try and really get it faithfully, this is what I said about the further you go back in time, the harder it is.
Yes.
So, but I mean, look at Hilary Mantel. She you know, you believe you're there, don't you? You believe you're hearing these people. Well, she obviously was not right. Well, maybe no, she did read, I'm sure, a lot of documents from that time.
She must have done, yeah.
But so yes, absolutely. Happy to reiterate, definitely read books. And as I said, if you can watch film or documentaries, do that if you can. Because even if you're watching silent film, if you're doing something about the First World War, say, of the Edwardians, you can pick up an awful lot of detail about clothes or shoes or you know, things they use. But obviously, if you go too far back, well, if you go not very far back, you're not going to be able to have film. But definitely, the more you read things set in that time, written in that time, the better. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Some interesting questions coming in around, I kind of guess how to improve your, well, discussion about how to get published. And one of the questions that Julie mentions is, well, I'll give it to you word for word. So I'm having problems integrating female characters as if we are being authentic. The class and employment area I'm dealing with does not have many visible women unless they're sex workers. I worry that I'm going to have to be anachronistic or just have a big gender imbalance and consequently put some publishers off.
It's a very valid concern. The thing is, down through history, women have done stuff. And even in a society where most women weren't able to, or most women were too scared to, you know, the things that held women back were class, money, and marriage, to put it really simplistically. But women have always managed, and working class women and poor women and married women have always managed to get things done. There's always been women down through history who have been the exception. So it's not out, and you know, if you look back even to sort of Tudor times, there were a lot of women who owned businesses and stuff. Their circumstances were that their husband was dead or their father was dead, you know, but it's all the way down through history. Women have managed to find a place of power. They've managed to find a place of agency. So again, it's the creative challenge to make this believable. If you want more women characters, find a way to give them the agency to come into the story. A credible reason. It's got to be a credible reason, obviously. But it's a very valid concern, and it's also a concern about publication, because it depends who you're aiming the book at. But as a very broad generalization, more women read historical fiction than men. That's a very broad generalization,
right. And
it depends on the period you're writing about as well.
Yeah.
So you do want, you know, I would recommend having as much of a mix, or at least one or two. Yeah.
Okay. On that subject about kind of getting published, so and it's slightly linked. Catherine's asked a question about. She's asked, how much of a market is there currently for alternate history? So I'm writing an alternate history novel with a female protagonist who actually existed. I get the impression that most alternate history is male focused. I enjoy what I'm writing, but I want to make sure it will be published and be successful.
You see, I'm not sure what that term means, so I'm going to take a guess and then tell me if you're right. Do you mean somebody like, say, Mary, like the recent film about Mary Anning having an affair with another woman, would that be alternate history? Can somebody give me a quick?
Put this to anyone can answer that in chat, please do. Maybe we'll move on while waiting. I'm
gonna sort of assume that that's what it means. I'm just gonna say the same thing again. You know, there was a bit of a hoo-ha. I am in fact related to Mary Anning, obviously very distantly, but I am. But there was a bit of a hoo-ha from some people who said, you know, Mary Anning, there's absolutely no proof that Mary Anning was gay. There's also no proof that she wasn't. And I think it's open to interpretation. And my personal opinion is that she was married to her fossils, but that's just me. But you know, the writer and director of the film made it very clear that this was just their interpretation.
Right.
And that's fine. If you, I mean, that it can be very interesting, actually.
So there's a good example here. The Man in the High Castle.
Yes, exactly. Oh, yes. So yes, and I've worked on a book which is the premise is that the Germans did invade the UK.
Yeah.
And that, you know, so yes, that is absolutely, go for it. But then that is, you've really got to you're making a lot of work for yourself, because it's got to be really credible. But fantastic if you can do it. And why not? Why shouldn't you do it? Yes, people love that. Yeah.
We've only got the things always fly by. We've only got probably 4 or 5 minutes left, and I've still got about 10 questions to try and get through. I may not get through to them all tonight. Just at this point, just to say, do reach out on Twitter, through LinkedIn, through the Facebook group, through our support channel. If you have questions you'd like answered and we don't get around to tonight, we'll always try and get back to you at a later point.
Can I just say, Tom, I would be up for that as well. I'm happy to answer questions that couldn't be answered tonight.
That's just as well, because I can't answer them, Sal. It has to be you. Okay, so my story, this comes from, W. Prenevost. My story, the Bugatti family, goes from the Belle Epoque era to pre-World War II. So should I be establishing the time changes through things like clothing styles, newly established technology, telegrams to telephones, or directly by saying it was summer 1998, for example? So
both.
Right.
So taking the first option, of course, use the technology and stuff as it changes, but be sure that you're not doing what I said. Be sure you're not pushing it in there. Do it with a very light touch. Always, and so this is just my opinion, and this is what I always tell people, but always put, you know, Lincoln 1928 at the top of a chapter. Most people won't even read it, but it's there. So if people want to check, especially if you're moving in time, especially very much so if you're going backwards and forwards in time, just put it at the top of a chapter or a change of scene. It's fine. And yes, of course, use it through changing technologies. That's what people will be more, which will notice more, but just be careful that you do it very gently, you know, that you don't get into exposition or information dumps or things like that, which will, you know, and this temptation to thrust everything in there. You don't want to thrust everything into your reticule. That's the last thing you want to do. So just a light touch.
Okay, Ollie's mentioned weather, distances by carriage, and how places looked in the 18th century. Any tips on how to research those?
Well, it's funny because you and I were talking about this, Tom, weren't we? Even in my early childhood in England, all the country, the proper country lanes had huge hedges that were almost met at the top, like that was like tunnels. So you couldn't see out across the fields or anything. They had these huge hedgerows. And this is why when you read contemporary novels of when those hedges existed, when people say they slept under hedgerows, it's not hedges like we think of them. There were these huge things that you could really sort of burrow into and be safe from the rain and dry and not be seen. So it is a case of sort of trying that kind of stuff. It is deep tissue research. I mean, I only know that because I remember when the hedges were cut down and it felt so weird that you could suddenly see these whole vistas. And now they realize, yes, sorry, I'm going to go, not relevant, but so location is terribly important, and to get the location, not just in an obvious way, but in things like that, is very, very important to do. And you can probably find, you know, people write books about everything. You can probably find, you know, country roads of Suffolk 1840 to 1863. You honestly can if you try.
This would be a good point to reference your own book, Sal.
No one here is interested in my own book.
Oh. Right, I'm going to put a link to it next time we talk.
No, it couldn't be more niche.
So for those of you who don't know, Sally's written a book about the history of Bailiff's Court, Hotel, which is a lovely, a beautiful old manor house, Sally? Or
it was a folly. It was
folly.
actually built in the but this is honestly, let's take some questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's take some questions.
Okay, well, we've literally got time for one more question. Let's have a quick look. Okay, so Shirley's asked another question. What about saying that a fictional character had an idea for an event which actually happened?
Yes. I mean, why not?
Yeah.
As long as it's credible, it's got to be credible.
Yeah.
So that's you know, and don't use, people fall back a lot when people are doing this. They tend to fall back an awful lot on coincidence.
Yes.
You can have a couple of coincidences in your plot. Don't have more than that, because it gets silly. Not, you know, ideally not even a couple, just one ideally. So don't, if somebody does that, no, that's great. That's creativity. This is what we want. It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Okay. Well, Sally, any last points? We do have to bring it to a close. So anything? I think I'm looking back at notes I made before. I think we've covered everything we set out to. And once again, dear listeners, I know we may not have covered every single question, so do follow up afterwards.
I would say one thing, which is probably blindingly obvious from what we've been saying, but just absorb yourself in the time that you're writing about. Just anything you can get your hands on. And although I'd say about the internet, you know, do use the internet, just be careful of the sources. YouTube, documentaries, books. Just absolutely absorb yourself in that time, and it will just make a huge difference. It really will.
Great. Okay, well, it's that point once again. Just before everyone disappears, just want to say a very big thank you to all of you for joining us. We really appreciate you giving up your time. We really appreciate you taking part, and that means contributing your questions as well as your advice in the chat panel. There will be a recording. It should go up tomorrow. It's placed on our Facebook page, not our Facebook page, sorry, our YouTube page. You can go there and subscribe and like and everything, so you'd find all of the recordings there. But we'll send that out to all of you who registered as well.
Can I just say something, Tom? I'm seeing, for some reason, I'm suddenly seeing comments, and I'm seeing a lot of familiar names coming up. I can't name you all, but it's lovely to see you all. I just wanted to say that. And it's lovely to see everyone, but nice to see some familiar names coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. So until we see you in March, I can't believe we're saying that already, but until we see you in March, everybody stay well, stay healthy. And we look forward to speaking to you then. Until then, thank you ever so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye all.
Bye, everyone.